Welcome to the Disrupt Your Career podcast, brought to you by Claire Harbour
and Antoine Tirard. We're passionate about helping everyone find fulfillment in their work life.
We believe that big, messy, uncharted career changes are inevitable, and it's up to you to decide.
Will you take control and disrupt, or allow yourself to be disrupted?
We wrote the book about it, and now we share here our conversations with other thinkers in this crucial area.
Settle down and get ready to listen to this dose of wisdom.
All right. Well, this time on the Disrupt Your Career podcast, I'm super excited to be welcoming Aliya Hamid Rao. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Methodology at the London School of Economics, LSE, and the author of an extraordinary book called Crunch Time. We'll come back to all of that later on. In the meantime, Aliya, welcome to the Disrupt Your Career podcast. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me, Claire. It's my pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, let's get into it. Let's start as we usually do with your career journey. You're a lifetime academic with multiple degrees from all kinds of different places, from St. Stephen's College in Delhi, from LSE, and from Penn, with teaching roles at Stanford, Singapore Management University, and currently at LSE. Your sphere of interest includes gender development and sociology, with a current focus on how family and gender play out in the workplace and careers. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how this extraordinary career unfolded? Was it by design? How much of a role did serendipity play? What have been your key moments of pride or achievements? And where have you found the challenges?
Thank you for that really generous introduction, Claire. So let me start by telling you how this kind of academic career started, which for me really was after I completed my master's at the London School of Economics, which is where I now teach. Back in 2008, I graduated into the Great Recession. My sort of aim at that time was to work in the United Nations, and I started working at the International Labour Organization, which kind of manages all the sort of workplace issues and so on the world over, essentially. So I was there for about a year and a half in various capacities as an intern, as an external collaborator, and so on. And one of the things that really became clear to me when I was at the International Labour Organization was just how precarious work had become. And I mean, work had always been unstable for, people from a lower socioeconomic background. But generally, we had conceived of work as being very stable, very lucrative for people with college degrees, with master's degrees, and so on. And what the Great Recession kind of solidified, what it consolidated, was basically just how unstable, how insecure everyone was. Of course, insecurity is not borne out equally. If you've been in jobs that pay you well, that have benefits, that even when you lose a job, it's not like you're kind of tumbling into the abyss. You have a lot of safety net, essentially. But those ideas of insecurity playing out in the lives of so many people were really percolating with me. So as I kind of went through my own time at the ILO, I decided that I had to go to graduate school to kind of study these things a little bit more, these kind of how people experience work and especially instability in work. And that's how I sort of entered into the academy. When I was doing my PhD, if I confess, I wasn't entirely sure that I would stay in academia. I had sort of thought that, I kind of learn more about these issues and then I perhaps come back into another UN sort of role or a work think tank or something. And I remember this quite clearly. It was sort of during my third year of my PhD program. And I was in the US. So in the US, what you do is you take classes for a number of years before you actually embark on your dissertation. So it's a commitment of many years. And at that time, in the third year of my program, I decided that, this was really something I really enjoyed a lot. And this is sort of where I wanted to spend my time. So that's how I kind of came into academia. And I would say I've been, quite committed to it since then, just because it gives us the autonomy to explore questions that I think are pressing without a lot of oversight or someone else kind of guiding your research agenda. So that's one of the things that appeals to me the most.
Okay, that autonomy, that independence, really to drive towards where exactly you feel attention is needed to create important change in life.
Exactly.
Beautiful. So I'm wondering, in that earlier part of your career, in all those different establishments and cultures that you found yourself in at the different stages of both study and work outside academia, what lessons did you learn in terms of, the types of organizations, and then what drew you specifically towards gender, family, and so on, and their influence on the workplace and individual careers?
I had sort of practical experience of how insecurity and instabilities felt how kind of organizations at the top level try to influence policies at the country level and so on, right? But it was in the kind of academic readings. And what I was reading about unemployment was, for instance, I remember the book that was so influential for me was Catherine Newman, who is an anthropologist and a sociologist. Her work, it's called Falling from Grace. And this is a beautiful book that looks at managers in New York City who'd lost their jobs. So again, like, the men, it was all men actually, all men, like, the kinds who get up, wear a suit and maybe take the train into commute, that kind of very movie-like image, essentially. But she also looked at downward mobility amongst other groups, amongst women who had gotten divorces. But the couple of chapters on the unemployed managers really struck a chord with me, because what Catherine Newman did is she really unearthed the emotional impact about how, she had this one kind of heart-wrenching example of a man who'd lost his job, who'd been the primary earner in his family. This is the 80s in New York. And rather than kind of tell his family and his wife that he'd lost his job, he would get dressed as if for work and go to like a public library and spend his day in the public library, because this feeling of shame was so great, which she captured. And one of the things that struck me is when I read the afterword to her book, she said, one of the things I kind of regret is that in this study, I didn't really have any women. But I think if I had had women, what I would find now is that paid work, participating in paid work is so important for women's sense of self that I would think that they had similar experiences as men do. And to me, that really struck me. I was like, why don't we have research that looks at women's experiences, given that women do participate in the labor force? Progress hasn't been excellent there. And certainly in recent years, it's not been excellent there, but women have reached some sort of unprecedented levels than they were in, let's say, the 60s or the 70s. So that kind of always was in the back of my mind, like, why haven't we studied this? And are their experiences the same? The other thing to keep in mind is that, when I started my project, there was a lot of talk about how cultural conceptions of masculinity were changing, that it was possible now that men weren't just required to kind of earn and provide for their families, but there were cultural models that kind of asked men to be involved fathers, to spend time at home, do a lot of housework and so on. So there was a lot of research coming up about that. And so I designed my study, the book, Crunch Time, that you mentioned, to really be able to compare men and women's experiences to kind of get a grasp, have things moved on in the way that Catherine Newman predicted, in the way that a lot of this research on cultural models of masculinity is predicting, or what's going on. That's sort of how I got interested in this.
Beautiful. How wonderful that it was, in the end, I'm oversimplifying, but it was one book, one piece of thinking that spurred you into exploring not just along that line, but around it. That's beautiful and rather disruptive in many respects. Let's go back. Let's not forget this question of the different establishments and cultures that you worked in and the sorts of lessons that working in them taught you.
Being in the ILO was extremely rewarding. It was a very international group of people, as you would expect. But I think one of the things I felt in that particular role, and I wasn't really there for such a long time either, most of my career, professional life has really been in academic institutions. But one of the things I learned from there was that I think it was really important for me to sort of be on the ground. And I'm using air quotes that way. This, I think, explains a lot of like why I do research the way I do it, which is that I'm really kind of, interviewing people who've lost their jobs. I'm interviewing their spouses. I'm hanging out with some of them in their families when they allow me to kind of get a sense of what job loss feels like on a very day-to-day basis for them. And I think graduate school gave me that. So that was the University of Pennsylvania. What it taught me was the importance of, again, autonomy in determining your own kind of professional career and your own research agenda, your intellectual life in a way. And of course, there are constraints. You're working within a discipline. For me, that discipline happens to be sociology. I do think sociology sort of lends itself to a lot of interdisciplinarity, which is very nice. But at the same time, there are those kinds of constraints. But I think as far as professional careers go, being an academic, when you have the kind of job I have, what we call in the US tenure track or on the permanent contract in the UK, I think you do get the pleasure of determining your own research agenda. And you get support for that in the form of, if you apply for grants, for instance, and you're successful with some of that, but also colleagues who kind of are willing to read your work and engage with you intellectually. So that I find incredibly rewarding. Sometimes I'm sort of like, I can't believe that my job is to read and think and write. People whose work I admire, I get to read it, and that's part of my job.
So it sounds as though you're very firm at this stage in your choice to remain in academia rather than joining organizations, whether UN type organizations or others. and your pleasures are well defined and understood. How do you manage to keep variety and range within your work?
So this is something I've been thinking about a lot, because a lot of what I have done has been solo. So it's, research that I'm kind of going ahead and designing and conducting in a solo way. Of course, there's a lot of support that you have as you talk with peers and so on. And the good thing is my kind of research, I'm not just analyzing this detached data set. My research means that I'm going out talking to people. So that's very interactive. But one of the ways that I've intentionally kind of brought in variety has been to collaborate with people. I'm working, for instance, on 2 collaborative projects. One is with a research fellow in the Department of Methodology at the LSE, and we're working on a mixed methods project on discrimination in online labor markets. And this is Dr. Sean Brook, and she's really spearheading that. And I'm giving some advice on the background, I would say. And then another project, which is actually with 9 faculty across 3 different universities in the UK. And it's completely mixed methods. It's economists, it's psychologists, it's sociologists like myself, behavioral scientists. So it's very mixed methods. And with a variety of methods, we are focusing on the diversity pipeline, basically looking from where diversity sort of in the workforce, what are the mechanisms that limit it, that minimize it, even though so much effort is often put in by organizations, including universities and schools and so on, to have a diverse kind of population, what's happening there. And my role on this project is I'm a co-lead on the qualitative side of it. So basically, we are interviewing 200 people across different sectors, and we are being very mindful of how we are operationalizing diversity. So typically, traditionally, diversity has been thought of as sort of race, ethnicity, and sex, primarily sex and gender. And here we're also expanding this out to look at sort of neurodiversity, for instance, being very mindful of including social class, being very mindful of including not just sex and gender, but sort of also gender fluid, like the various different ways that people identify and experience life, essentially. What sort of helps people be more productive at work and what constrains their productivity at work. So I basically just talk to people about their working life. That's been hugely fun and interesting for me.
A massive project too, 200 subjects to study from all those different angles. That's not going to be done next month, is it?
No.
But very exciting. And many of the themes are themes that we've looked at in articles and book chapters that we've done. The reality is that diversity is multifaceted, and still far too often in 2023, it's seen as, so long as we include women, then we'll be fine. And if you're going to be producing a big study with some strong conclusions, then that's going to be beautifully important for the whole world to hear. Let's shift the perspective a little bit and talk about how you can think about how you build on your learning and experience, being the academic that you are and having seen so many individuals in their various career stages. What advice do you have for early career professionals who are looking to start out their own careers?
This is not a very rosy piece of advice, but I think this is very realistic, is just as we look at what the economic context is. I started my study in unemployment because I was very much shaped by the Great Recession. For anyone who kind of graduated into the labor market, then this was a huge pivotal moment of our life. Just last year, we've seen like all this news of, layoffs that are happening in companies that we thought were sort of safe, right? Like the tech sector, which had always been kind of making so many profits, where salaries and perks were incredible. We've seen something like Google laying people off, which really seems unprecedented, right? For that sector. In a way, of course, we've seen consultancies and banks laying off the bottom 10% of performers, however they calculate that kind of a thing. We're seeing that. And I think for me, the advice I would give is, and certainly the stats bear this out, that I think if you're working in the private sector, I think in most sectors, you don't expect a job for life. And I don't know that anyone is sort of naive enough to necessarily expect that, but expect that you also may be made redundant or have some sort of reorganization or downsizing that you're a part of, just because this is how organizations work. I'm in the academic sector and we see this as generally very secure, but there's been like massive strikes this year, for instance, and we've seen a lot of news of redundancies. Just recently, I was reading about the University of Brighton. They've made 100 redundancies in the university across. I think they've eliminated the entire philosophy department from what I understood, but I just glanced at it. This is impacting basically every sector of life, including sectors of life and individuals who we thought were most protected from it, right? Like when you're someone with a PhD, we don't expect that you'll be losing a job. I mean, I don't think that anyone should be necessarily, or I think there should be a safety net, but certainly these are the people that we thought were very well suited to survive these kinds of things. And I think what we're learning is that really no one is.
I think that's a very interesting distinction that you draw too, the one between, we've known for a while now, and all of our work is predicated on this, that there is no longer a career for life. But the distinction within that, which is that not only will you be changing jobs quite a lot through your career, and some of those will be in titles and roles that we haven't even imagined yet, but also there will almost inevitably be fallow periods, whether you lose a job or whether you can't maintain it for some other reason. But the likelihood is that there will be highs and lows in terms of earning and activity beyond just the fact that you will change and evolve. As you say, not particularly rosy, but very much a realistic approach to take, and not one that's easy to feed a 16-year-old or a 21-year-old when they're at those crucial points in their education and everything seems possible. So that's a fascinating idea also, to be thinking about how do we build that into high school and university education as a way of thinking. But let's not progress too far. Let's get back to you. I'd love to talk about your book, Crunch Time, How Married Couples Confront Unemployment. Tell us more about your motivation to create a book as opposed to a paper, and what are the main themes that we'd find inside?
It's based on the research that I did with unemployed families, and this is research that's in the US. And I mentioned that just because there are some empirical differences and contextual differences in the safety nets in countries. And in the US, what I did was I focused on families. The requirements to be part of the study were to be married and to be in a heterosexual marriage. And there were reasons for that, which I can talk about if you like. To be in a heterosexual marriage and have children who are dependent on you, which I decided was 22 years and younger. And the reason I decided was 22 years rather than say 18, which is when children in the US are sort of legal adults, was because in the US, it's a 4-year college education, and most professional middle-class parents, their kids go to college. So, and they're paying for that. So that was the idea.
They're heavily dependent. Yes.
Exactly. Heavily dependent. And to have college degrees. So this was a very kind of highly educated sample. And in terms of their household income, when both partners were employed, the household incomes were typically in the top 10 to 15%. So it's a relatively of US income. So it was a relatively affluent sample. And what I did was I interviewed unemployed men and unemployed women. That's how I recruited them. And then where possible, I sought to interview their spouses. At times, I also interviewed their kids. And then I spent time observing families, 2 of unemployed men and 2 of unemployed women, in their household as they sort of went about their daily life. And my aim really was just to understand what unemployment means for them, how they experience it, and how do they reorganize, if at all, their families around this job loss. Now, with people who are this sort of highly educated and high earning, essentially, their experience of unemployment is interesting because it's actually, they tend to be in long-term unemployment, which in the US, the Bureau of Labor Statistics sort of calculates as about 26 weeks and above, so about 6 months and above. They tend to be in that because it's not so easy to find the kinds of job that they've lost, essentially. And what I find in the book is that with unemployed men, their job loss is treated as this very urgent problem that needs to be rectified as soon as possible. And the way that it's rectified is that unemployed men are given all the time that they need to search for jobs. So the idea is that the best use of unemployed men's time is to be searching for jobs. Now, this protects them from kind of doing any housework. So keep in mind, their wives are employed and they're working in most cases full-time, in some cases part-time, but they're the ones who are involved in paid work. But even then, the sort of division of housework doesn't really change. Childcare is very expensive. And families of unemployed men told me about how they made very minimal changes to any childcare expenses, including retaining, if they had full-time nannies, they retained them because they thought it was super important in order to allow the unemployed man to search for a job. The sort of downside for unemployed men, I have to say, in this was that there was a lot of emotional focus that they should find a job as quickly as possible. There was a bit of accountability that, why haven't you found this? Some men described it as being a bit nagging, being draconian, this expectation that you just take anything that you can get as long as you're providing. Now with unemployed women, this was not the case. So the women that I had in my sample, and it's worth mentioning, I oversampled for women who earn as much or more than their husbands who had lost their jobs. Now, this is not demographically. When you look at the US, I think at the time, less than 30% of households had women who were primary earners. So basically, the families of unemployed men and unemployed women were very comparable. But with unemployed women, what I found was that there was no such compulsion, that job loss was not seen as this major problem. It was seen as like, okay, this is an unfortunate event that happened, but you know what? This is an opportunity that now gives you the time to be, as one participant said, the kind of mom that my wife couldn't be before, presumably because she was engaging in paid work. And women said this themselves as well, that, I can kind of be involved in parent-teacher associations, or, just spending more time with my kid during the summer or whatever than I could have before. But because searching for a job was not seen as so important for unemployed women, what that meant was their time was no longer protected. Their time was not protected to search for jobs. So basically, women spent their time around unpaid work in the house, taking care of their kids, doing the cleaning, doing the cooking. So even before job loss, the women had been doing more than their husbands, but after job loss, it sort of became their entire responsibility. And they still job searched. These were women. Part of the recruitment criteria was that everyone needed to be searching for a job so that they weren't sort of opting out, quote unquote, out of the labor force. But the way they searched for jobs was they did it around their other obligations. They were going to a parent-teacher association meeting. They might work on their job applications in between breaks. If they were taking their kid to a sports event where their kid was competing, they might be sitting on the bleachers and working on their applications. They were just doing it in a very fragmented way. What this research shows is just how different the experiences were and how families responded to job loss.
I was going to say fantastic, but that's not really actually the right word, is it? Interesting and not necessarily very encouraging. So when we see these gendered career paths after job loss, and we think about what you've just said about the way women were and probably still are doing their job search at this stage in life, what sort of practical advice do you have for women job seekers when they're in that phase, whether they're living with a husband or not?
What I saw happening with a lot of the women, when I kind of went back and I interviewed them again about where their career paths had sort of gone, the women with kids who were younger, so less than 12, again, that's usually where there's a lot of childcare requirements when kids are not independent and they need a lot of looking after by either parent or by a caregiver. Those women had sort of, at least temporarily, seemingly detached themselves from the labor force, where searching for a job was really kind of put to the back burner. They were still doing it, but some of them often said that, I'm looking for mommy hours when the kid is in the school, for instance. I don't know that I have advice, but what I would say is I would just make sure that women know what this means, what this retreat from the labor force means, which is that, and this is not my research, this is other research, which shows that these kinds of not being part of the labor force or detaching from it a little bit has very grave repercussions for your earnings over the life course. It has very grave repercussions for the kind of position that you can get into. There's work, for instance, by a colleague in the US, Kate Weishar, who shows that the penalty of career gaps, especially because of caregiving, are actually stronger than the penalties of job loss itself. So if you've been out of a professional work or whatever because of job loss, that's better than kind of a career being out of caregiving. Now, this is grave. This is grave because the kinds of people who tend to opt out or be out of labor force are women for caregiving purposes. But the penalties are immense. They're huge. So I would say just be aware that this is the context in which you would be making these decisions, just to kind of know what that entails. I think the other thing that I might add is that in terms of rehiring, there's also a huge penalty, and it's difficult to get rehired after leaving the workforce for caregiving responsibilities, for instance. So these are a few things I would want people to kind of keep in mind as they make the decisions that they make.
For sure. And those are, again, damning but helpful observations, which are borne out by some of the stories that we've had in articles we've written about coming back after a break and that kind of thing. I'm thinking that so many of the subjects that you have researched about and write about are subjects which it would be incredibly easy to become embittered and angry about day to day without respite. And I'm wondering, how do you manage to keep calm and objective in your line of work and yet feed your passion for more equality? It would be really interesting to hear how this works for you and how it might help our listeners who are thinking about how to shape their careers.
the reality is that I'm not able to stably keep my passion up or not be embittered. There are times when I sort of read all this research about motherhood penalties or the gaps to careers or the havoc that job loss wreaks. I mean, really, when I saw the news articles coming out, especially last fall and earlier this spring, this is going to be devastating for thousands of people. Even when it's like, a small percentage of an organization, it's devastating for the people going through it, because I think the way that society still is structured, and even though job loss is so common and redundancies are so common, we're not at a place where we see these as commonplace. We still have that kind of social stigma and around seeing people as flawed, as though they could have done something to protect themselves. And I think that's like a horrendous way of looking at it. But anyway, sorry, to go back to your question, I think the way I do it is that I work with people. I said that I do some collaborative work. For instance, the work on productivity that I'm doing with the other 9 co-Is and so on is we're trying very hard to work with organizations to see how we can feed back our findings about what kind of constraints diversity and productivity in the workplace, to kind of come up with policies that can hopefully help a diversity of people be productive in the workplace, essentially. Those kinds of things, with those kind of private sector collaborations with research findings, with academic findings, those give me a little bit of hope. I think organizations are often very mindful of it, even if they're imperfect. In many ways, in enacting it, they are often mindful of trying to be aware of the problems, and at a deeper level, in some cases, trying to change them.
Brilliant. So this idea that organizations, on sort of recommendation and having your research fed to them in some ways, could be helping to affect the change that we all need, is certainly one that gives hope. I realize that you're still in the middle of this big collaborative 9-party research, but nevertheless, if you could get on a soapbox today and tell these organizations what they should be doing, whether they're private sector organizations, social policy makers, citizens, whatever, what would you be saying on the soapbox?
As an academic, I can't get on a soapbox until I have the findings. And we don't have the findings. We don't have the findings for the UK. But what I can say is that there was this wonderful book that I'm holding up. It's called Getting to Diversity: What Works and What Doesn't. It's by Frank Dobbin, who's at Harvard, and Alexandra Kolev. And they look at the US case, and they look at loads and loads of organizations and examining the various kinds of policies, procedures, and so on that these organizations have put into place to basically augment diversity. And they look at what works and what doesn't. So I would say that anyone who's serious about diversity and inclusion, take a look at this book, read it, because it's chock-a-block full of helpful and really thoughtful, like super thorough data and guidance on how to kind of implement it in your own organization. So I would say take a look at this, keeping in mind this is based on US organizations. And of course, there are differences between organizations through the country context, but still, this is super helpful. So this is what I would say on this soapbox for now.
Okay, thank you. So the soapbox will tell us to read that book, which we'll make sure we put in the show notes. When you think about the reading you've done in that and other stuff that's emerging from your work, can you cite any examples of organizations that might be doing a bit better when it comes to talent management, and particularly with regard to DE&I? People are often hesitant to name companies. You don't necessarily need to name them. But if you have examples of some organization somewhere that's doing something really well, we'd love to hear about it.
When it comes to diversity, for instance, people often tend to focus on the hiring stage of when you have junior hires. I'm an assistant professor, so this is the kind of stage that people might focus on. But I think a lot of the problem is, do people like me or others progress up the hierarchy? Do they progress up? That's really where the issue is. And what we find is that a lot of gatekeeping in organizations really happens not at this entry level necessarily, but as people progress up. So keeping an eye on that, on making sure that the higher the kind of position or whatever, the more kind of leadershipy the position, the more status the position has, the better paid the position is, that's really where you're getting people in. And I think often organizations don't necessarily keep an eye on that. You've heard about the glass cliff, that in organizations, people bring in women or diverse candidates, women of all color and men of color, in when the organization is in trouble. So when it kind of goes down, it goes down with a woman in the lead. So, avoiding stuff like that, for instance, would be a thing. Like, when are you bringing people in, and are you bringing them in at a time when they can grow and kind of prove themselves? essentially.
Beautiful. Yeah, we recently did a podcast with our friend Janine Matteau, who's working very closely with organizations and with young women to ensure that there's less of that glass cliff and that there's more openness to keeping those diverse recruits in and fed and growing throughout their careers. So I guess we're all moving in the right direction, even if it's painfully slow. Now let's go way back to 18-year-old Aliya. What advice would you want to give her if you could go back and talk to her now?
Try to keep the little joys alive at all times so that all this kind of burden, the very kind of, dismal academic findings about gender inequality and so on, don't weigh you down. And that means, the little joys are really things like enjoying a sunny day, for instance, taking the time out to do that. If you're reading a book, getting to diversity, like I said, doing it under the shade of a tree, by a little brook or something of that kind, just kind of keeping an eye on that. And the other thing I would say is to really keep up with non-academic reading too, because that also brings pleasure. And that kind of, I think, in my mind, can help enhance our perspective about human life. And that's really what social scientists are doing at the end of the day. So to be a bit more mindful about keeping that practice. I try still, I would say to my credit as a not 18-year-old, but to kind of make a habit of that, of doing that always.
Terribly important and absolutely crucial as well. If you get monotonous in your reading, then you get monotonous in your thinking by definition.
Absolutely.
Brilliant advice. Wonderful. What do you think is going to be the most exciting thing on your plate between now and the end of the year?
So the thing I'm excited about a lot is I'm in the process of designing what I hope will be my next book project. I'm teasing it out. It also will, at this point, kind of look at insecurity in the workplace, but through a diversity of professions to see how it impacts how people respond to it. In the book, I really focused on this heterosexual married family with children. And so there's a particular story that I was able to tell because that's what happens in those kinds of families. But other people also experience unemployment, as should go without saying. What I've been thinking a lot about is how people who are not part of families, for instance, what is their social safety net then? And how does gender matter for them when they lose their jobs, even when they've had very high paying jobs with great benefits? So I want to be a little bit more mindful of the different stories that are there to kind of learn from and that are there that people experience. So designing that, thinking about how best I can really kind of capture people's realities and people's experiences and maybe do justice to their emotional lives. Trying to figure that out, how best to do that is sort of what's next on the plate for me.
That sounds like a fascinating project, and we will be extremely interested to follow that. And indeed, possibly to feed you some ideas for people you might talk to.
Oh, because I would love that.
So much work with, different individuals through their good and bad times that there may be some that are just sitting in our archives that could be perfectly right for you. So let's see how that goes. But in the meantime, Aliya, it's been an absolute pleasure having you with me today. We've talked about so many different things. And although, as you said, it's not all rosy, it's wonderful to know that there's somebody beavering away every single day, working on finding out how to make it better for everybody. It's so important.
It was such a delight for me to be on this podcast with you. Thank you so much for having me again and for listening to my experiences and what I do.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
We hope you enjoyed hearing from this month's guest as much as we did.
Do go and check out our work on disrupt-your-career.com and come back soon. Thank you.